a similar compound. The stories of American Edgar Allan Poe were studied with the imagery of opium dreams. Opium use had been widespread for thousands of years, especially in the Orient. At the point where we entered the story, distinguished writers, painters, and politicians right across Europe were concerned less with the medical value of the poppy than with testing its visionary powers.
The use of opium was very widespread in 19th century Britain. The drug was imported completely freely without any restrictions at all. And once inside the country, it was sold in a variety of different outlets. The patent medicines like Dr. Collis Brown's chlorodyne. There were children's cordials used for putting children to sleep like Godfrey's cordial and Dalby's carminative. There were widespread general preparations like laudanum, which is a mixture of opium and alcohol. And there was even raw opium itself, sold in shops and on market stalls in pills and penny sticks. I think opium use probably did mask medical problems, and it certainly caused some medical problems of its own. There was a quite high level of accidental overdosing with opiates.
For almost 40 years, Coleridge had a love-hate relationship with opium. A year after first taking it, he wrote Kubla Khan or A Vision in a Dream, widely regarded as the most obviously opiated of his works. In the introduction, Coleridge is typically evasive. He claims that, in consequence of a slight indisposition, an anodyne had been prescribed, from the effects of which he fell asleep in his chair. Before that, he'd been reading about the building of a great palace. When he awoke 3 hours later, he found that he'd composed between 200 and 300 lines of verse in his head. Writing them down, he was disturbed by a visitor from Porlock and promptly forgot all but 54 of them. In Xanadu did Kubla Khan a stately pleasure dome decree, where Alph the sacred river ran, through caverns measureless to man, down to a sunless sea.
The positive contribution which opium made to Coleridge's writing was that it helped him to observe changing states of consciousness. Like Dickinson, he was interested in dreams, he was interested in the process of falling asleep, he was interested in fantasy, he was interested in changes in perception. Opium did enable him to observe all these things, perhaps more sharply than he would have done otherwise. It helped him perhaps as a philosopher and psychologist, rather than as a poet.
When Coleridge wrote about opium in his private letters, it was the language of guilt, of remorse, of anguish, of torture. But it would be wrong to imagine that Coleridge was untroubled in his mind before he became addicted to opium. He once observed that it seemed to him as though he'd always been pursued by some great dread. And it's interesting that the Rime of the Ancient Mariner, his best-known poem, so powerfully articulates the theme of dread, yet it was actually written long before he became an opium addict.
Taking opium was simply one way in which he was an outsider, but equally he saw sloth, he saw his overuse of alcohol, he saw his failure to relate to other people in significant ways as all parts of the same failure, the same tendency to be a kind of ancient mariner or isolated figure.
The fact that the ancient mariner has to endlessly confess, to endlessly talk about his sin, is very reminiscent of the current belief that, promoted by the Narcotics Anonymous system, that one never recovers from addiction and one always has to confess and talk about it.
We're looking at a period where the religious impulse was very strong, but when the churches and theology seem to have been dead. God wasn't dead, but I think the churches were, as far as the creative intelligentsia were concerned. People were looking for other ways to make contact with the spiritual.
If God was losing his outline for many, his residue could still be found in the visions of the painter, Mad John Martin, who exerted a tremendous influence on the romantic imagination of the day, and whose landscapes were later much admired by Turner. His vast cosmic biblical scenes with their towering buildings and gripping depictions of satanic struggle greatly inspired Shelley, Keats, and De Quincey. In France, too, his hallucinatory cityscapes captivated writers who made no secret of their own fascination with the cavernous inner worlds of the opium dream.
People who have specifically done their art after taking opium beforehand, like Meissonier and Michaud, tend to produce a very stereotyped art when they actually try to put it on canvas. Picasso said it was the most intelligent of all the odors, but it gave him less desire to actually go and execute the work. If it did have an impression on John Martin's art, it was that he had a vision in a dream, and then on another occasion he put it down on canvas.
Wherever one looks, in the artistic and political cliques of the 19th century opium culture, there falls the shadow of Thomas de Quincey. In 1804, while he was an undergraduate at Oxford, the young writer took opium for the first time to relieve the pains of persistent toothache. By 1821, he was taking industrial doses daily.
De Quincey's contemporaries saw his opium use on the whole as a slightly ridiculous foible, something a little bit embarrassing, something that stopped him from keeping appointments, something that made him miss deadlines. But De Quincey also used it as a stock in trade. He became famous quite early on as the English opium eater.
Mr. De Quincey, when you look back on a lifetime of addiction, do you feel you had a proper measure of the drug?
If in early days I'd fully understood the powers of this mighty drug, when judiciously regulated, 1, to tranquilize all irritations of the nervous system, 2, to stimulate the capacities of enjoyment, and 3, under any call for extraordinary exertions, to sustain through 24 consecutive hours the else drooping animal energies. Most certainly, knowing or suspecting all this, I should have inaugurated my opium career in the character of one seeking extra power and enjoyment rather than one shrinking from extra torment.
De Quincey's Confessions of an English Opium Eater is a marvellous book. It's not only about drugs, it's an autobiography of the romantic imagination, very close in some ways to Wordsworth's Prelude, but going into far more fantastic and secretive areas of experience.
I was stared at, hooted at, grinned at, chattered at by monkeys, by parakeets, by cockatoos. I was worshipped. I was sacrificed. I was buried for 1,000 years in stone coffins with mummies and sphinxes in narrow chambers at the heart of eternal pyramids. I was kissed with cancerous kisses by crocodiles, and laid, confounded with all unutterable slimy things amongst reeds and nilotic mud.
I don't think it made De Quincey a better writer, but I don't think a drug will make anyone a better writer. What it did was to provide him with a subject at a time when he badly needed one. His opium use became the experience on which he could capitalize, around which he could write his autobiography, and that gave him his first break into the literary world.
Opium, in common with many other drugs, is found naturally within the plant kingdom. Opium is derived from the juice or the resin of the opium poppy, Papaver somniferum. The main active ingredient was found in 1807 to be morphine. Morphine, in fact, comes from the Greek god Morpheus, the god of dreams. So a sleepiness and perceptual changes can occur with the drug. In order to understand how opium itself can produce effects on the brain, we need to briefly consider the ways in which nerve cells in the brain, of which there are millions, talk to each other. And a major critical event in the way in which they communicate is by the release of a transmitter. These act on receptors. Now, since it was unlikely the receptor would evolve waiting for opium to come along, that possibly there were chemicals in the brain that use this receptor, and all that morphine was doing was simply mimicking their action.
When he does write of the darker places to which opium dispatched him, the normally perky De Quincey closely echoes Coleridge's description of the travails of the ancient mariner. The many men so beautiful, and they all dead did lie, and a million, million slimy things lived on, and so did I. Do some mind-altering drugs have a consistent effect upon the imagination? Is there an art typical of opium, as distinct from, say, cannabis? Certainly guilt plays a larger part in the reveries of the opium taker because of the bondage that the drug imposes on the unwary user. But not all artists who have taken drugs were racked by guilt. Edgar Allan Poe, like Coleridge, was reticent about his private habits. But his reputation as an incorrigible liar doesn't suggest guilt so much as an untiring opportunism. In the view of many, he was also a plagiarist, a racist, and a drunk.
He was perceived as being an addict for two reasons. First, that he created opium addicts, and very successfully created opium addicts. In the two stories, Ligeia and The Fall of the House of Usher, he creates stories which are spoken through a confessional I, and that I is often associated with Poe himself, though of course Poe invented these characters as much as he invented other characters. They are not merely duplications of Poe himself. And the other reason why Poe, I think, is often associated with taking opium is that he was a renowned taker of drink. And later in the century, this was transmuted almost by association into opium taking. Underground chambers, preoccupation with premature burial, with vertigo, with excess fear, anxiety, neurosis. Themes like this would perhaps suggest that he was at least acquainted with anxieties that might derive from opium experience.
Mr. Poe, there are indications in your letters that you suffer from opium addiction.
I am excessively slothful and wonderfully industrious by fits. There are epochs when any kind of mental exercise is torture. I have thus rambled and dreamed away whole months and awoke at last to a sort of mania for composition.
And these moods, are they related to your use of drugs?
I live continually in a reverie of the future.
Do you recall, for example, your description of the use of morphine in A Tale of the Ragged Mountain?
Of course. The morphine had its customary effect, that of enduing all the external world with an intensity of interest, in the quivering of a leaf, in the hue of a blade of grass, in the humming of a bee, in the breathing of the wind. There came a whole universe of suggestion, a gay and motley train of rhapsodies and immethodical thought.
A condition you described in great detail in the character of Roderick Usher.
He suffered from a morbid acuteness of the senses.
So typical of the opium experience.
His voice had that leaden, self-balanced, and perfectly modulated guttural utterance which may be observed in the lost drunkard or the irreclaimable eater of opium.
Quite. It does seem clear, Mr. Poe, that your obsession with the drug was more than merely journalistic. While great strides were being made in some areas of medicine, such as the use of antiseptics in surgery, pioneered by Lister in 1860, the nature of addiction was poorly understood. This innocence was passed on to the opium users, of course, some of whom, unlike Coleridge and Poe, were remarkably frank about a level of use that they refused to accept as habituation.
Elizabeth Barrett Browning became ill when she was 15. This was not very unusual. In the 19th century, young women at about this age tended to think of themselves as ill of necessity. So eventually one of her doctors decided to try her out on opium. What in fact he gave her was morphine to begin with, and then they gave her laudanum as well. And she went on taking these doses really throughout the rest of her life. She had quite a substantial personal income of about £50 a quarter, and almost all of that went on the morphine that she was taking. In particular, rather interestingly, the person with whom she had a real kind of opium relationship was another writer, Mary Russell Mitford. Now, Mary Russell Mitford also took opium. So they used to exchange jolly letters saying, isn't it wonderful, and how very splendid that we can take this, and what a relief it is. It gets rid of any headache, it puts you to sleep, it wakes you up. And these two women felt very contented and satisfied within that relationship. There are, in Elizabeth Barrett's poetry, extraordinary passages which, while one couldn't possibly say that they were derived immediately from drug-induced hallucination, are very much the kinds of extreme things that one might expect from that situation. For instance, in Aurora Leigh, there's a passage where one of the characters has been raped, and she's describing the experience of this rape, and she describes it as having been buried alive.
Mrs. Browning felt no guilt about her condition, partly because medical and public opinion gave her no reason to. In the Paris of the 1840s and 50s, opium and cannabis were being tested enthusiastically by young poets and writers. The 25-year-old Parisian poet Charles Baudelaire had discovered De Quincey in 1845 and considered him a magnificent author. Baudelaire claimed to have an analytical interest in wine, hashish, and opium as elasticators of the imagination. Despite indulging in their pleasures, he always doubted that what he called the artificial paradises had any real value for art. Another figure concerned with the objective view was Dr. Jacques Joseph Moreau de Tours, a psychiatrist who administered hashish to himself and others in order to precipitate an artificial mental illness. The bohemians and artists of Paris were only too pleased to help. Among the first to be contacted by the doctor were Baudelaire and the writer Théophile Gautier. They formed the Club des Hashishiens, a group of artists eager to experiment with the drug.
The Club des Hashishiens was where Baudelaire first encountered hashish in the form that it was usually taken in those days, not as something you smoked, but as something you imbibed. And he was introduced to it, possibly by Gautier. It took place in a large mansion which had been divided into flats where Baudelaire was actually living at the time, so he didn't have very far to go. And it seemed to consist of a number of poets, writers, and artists, including, for instance, Delacroix.
It used to meet in the early evening, between 5 and 6 in the evening. There was coffee served with hashish, and this was followed by a meal, but the people would eat the hashish before the meal started, and the hashish would begin to have effect, so that by the end of the meal they would go from the dining room into another room.
After a while they would fall into, they would start behaving very erratically and very hilariously, and then they would fall into stupor, and that would be more or less the end until they came out of it.
Human beings can experience any amount of pain, but we're all limited, according to Gautier, as far as experiencing happiness is concerned. And what he enjoyed about the hashish experience was that it seemed to take him right to the very edge of the amount of happiness that was tolerable.
Along the deserted quay, among the mass of dark buildings, it was hard to find the house that I was seeking. But my coachman, standing on his seat, was able to read on a marble plaque the half-effaced name of the old house, which was the meeting place of the initiated.
How did you actually take the hashish?
A piece of greenish paste or sweetmeat, about as large as my thumb, was taken out of a crystal vase by Dr. Moreau with the aid of a spatula, and placed beside a mother-of-pearl spoon on each saucer.
And when the drug took effect, what happened?
A vague warmth stole over my body, and a madness, like a wave breaking on a rock and retreating to hurl itself again, reached and withdrew from my brain, which it had finally engulfed. Hallucination of a strange guest had come to visit me. I looked up at the ceiling, and I saw a multitude of heads without bodies, like cherubim. Swarms of merry faces swirled round and round, creating a giddy, dizzying effect.
Well, hashish can be taken in many different forms. In fact, the active ingredient in hashish is a chemical called tetrahydrocannabinol, mercifully abbreviated to THC. The effects of THC on the brain include a feeling of perception being altered, sometimes visual, sometimes auditory, but in most subjects, the perceptual changes very often involve altered feelings of space and time.
The Hashishin were artists who saw themselves as scientists of the imagination. They felt that they were uncovering territory of vital interest to mankind. Although addiction wasn't socially acceptable, the taking of mind-altering drugs for what were called luxurious purposes wasn't frowned upon. Baudelaire, however, in his essay entitled On Wine and Hashish, condemned the drug for its capacity to subvert the will. Monsieur Baudelaire, Flaubert suggested that you, quote, insisted too much on the spirit of evil. It would have been better if you hadn't blamed hashish and opium excesses. How do you know what will come of it all later?
As far back as I can remember, I have been obsessed by the impossibility of accounting for certain sudden acts or thoughts in man, save on the hypothesis that there is an evil power external to him. That's a candid confession for which not all the serried ranks of the 19th century combined will make me blush.
Unlike De Quincey, Baudelaire predicted a Faustian fate for all those who failed to see the immorality implied in the pursuit of a false ideal. Well, whatever the poet's fears about having to pay a hellish price for his own drug habits, he succeeded in creating exquisite verse full of the flavor of both hashish and opium.
A Babel of stairways and arcades. There was an infinite palace. Massy cataracts, like curtains of crystal, hung, suspended, dazzling from walls of metal. Not trees, but colonnades encircled the sleeping pools, in which colossal nymphs admired their reflections like women. Expanses of water stretched blue between rosy and green embankments for millions of leagues towards the confines of the universe. There were fabulous stones and magic waves. There were enormous mirrors dazzled by all they reflected. Impassive, silent Ganges rivers in the sky poured down treasures of their urns into diamond abysses.
The third famous member of the Club des Hashishin was the writer Gérard de Nerval, author of Voyage to the East and Aurelia. So morose and despondent was his manner that Gautier may have had him in mind when he wrote, "It is the fashion to be pale and greenish looking, to appear to be wasted by the pangs and passions of remorse, and to talk sadly and fantastically about death."
One of Nerval's most notorious adventures was taking a lobster for a walk in the gardens of the Palais Royal using a blue ribbon as a lead. There was another time when Nerval stripped off his clothes in the street saying that he was going to get rid of all the trappings of reality. To some extent he was trying to provoke trouble, and to some extent he just had no idea of the norms. In a way this was characteristic of extreme romanticism. They wanted to shock the bourgeoisie, but with him it became a lifestyle.
After a few minutes, the effects of the hashish began to make themselves felt upon the young man and the stranger. A gentle languor spread over all their limbs. A vague smile hovered over their lips. They began to laugh, to move about, and speak with extreme volubility, especially the stranger. He seemed a prey to an exaggerated exhilaration. Hosts of new thoughts traversed his soul like whirlwinds of fire. And then the vision faded, and he collapsed limply upon the cushions.
I think Nerval's writing wouldn't have been what it was if he hadn't taken drugs. I think Nerval's whole quality as a poet depended on that kind of movement of consciousness that drugs encourages, where you get vivid glimpses, where you get discontinuities, where you get jump cuts, as in a dream.
In 1871, Rimbaud wrote to his friend Delahaye, "I say that it is necessary to become a seer. The poet makes himself a seer by a long, immense and reasoned disordering of all his senses, and exhausts within himself every kind of poison, retaining only the quintessences. Indescribable torture, in which he needs all his faith, all his superhuman force, in which he becomes the diseased one, the great criminal, and the great accursed, and also becomes the supreme scholar."
Well, the disorientation of the senses in French, le dérèglement de tous les sens, is the key phrase in Rimbaud's expose of what he meant by visionary poetry in the two letters which have become known since as the letters of the visionary. And what he meant by it was a systematic attempt to destroy all those conventions, intellectual conventions, moral conventions, conventions of feeling and imagination, which he felt stood in the way of real visionary poetry. I certainly think that the taking of drugs supplied Rimbaud, as it did supply Baudelaire, with a kind of model, a paradigm, an ideal, a reminder of what lyrical ecstasy could be at its best. But he was not, as far as I can make out, in any way dependent upon drugs for poetic inspiration.
Little evening of intoxication blessed by you. Rule and method, we are your champions. We do not forget how last night you glorified each one of us, young and old. We have faith in your poison. We know how to sacrifice our entire life every day. The time of assassins is here.
When he was in Abyssinia, Rimbaud took absolutely no interest in the literary reputation he was beginning to acquire in Paris, and seems to have had nothing much beyond contempt for literature, for poetry, for intellectual pursuits. And when he came back finally to France, it was to die.
And this old chestnut covered the widespread use of opium and hashish at parties and gatherings. In turn-of-the-century Paris, Modigliani was no stranger to these practices.
As a young man, Modigliani really came from a very respectable background, and it wasn't until he went to Venice at the age of 19 to study that he began to use drugs. He was introduced by a rather dubious baron from the Neapolitan family, and he also used to go to brothels in Venice. He became more worldly. Then when he went to Paris, he was riveted by the stories of drug taking. He liked to hear about people taking opium or cocaine or hashish. He often, at parties, he would be the one who would be standing at the door, master of ceremonies in this informal atmosphere, offering people pills, saying, "Go ahead, take them." He saw the artist as Superman, and he wrote a letter to a friend when he was in Venice recovering from tuberculosis, saying, "Your real duty is to save your dream."
Modigliani can't help us much because most of the time he was intoxicated by anything he could get his hands on. Here's as an example of a collision between art and drugs in which the art can't be related to the effects of just one single substance. One could argue that all intoxicants are educational, in that they show you things you wouldn't have experienced if you hadn't taken them. But this argument could also be applied to experiments like deliberately jumping off a high building or gargling with sand. If drugs existed that actually increased an artist's capacity to implement insights as well as providing them, then it might be easier to assess the connection between the art and the drug. We might shed some light on this problem by considering a period in the life of Picasso, in which the artist was both taking drugs and making a transition to a different style.
Picasso started using drugs very soon after he came to Paris in 1904, and we don't know the details, but I I think that he probably started using drugs in order to seduce Theodore Olivier. She was rather frigid and difficult, and according to her memoir, she says that he said he was going to buy a pipe, an opium pipe, and that's how he got her. And he got her away from somebody else, and they went on using opium for about 4 years. And I think that the Rose period is very much, has to be seen as a sort of manifestation of opium. But the sort of mysterious, sort of druggy atmosphere that those paintings have, the rather androgynous figures, you can't tell sometimes whether they're boys or girls. I think all of that is part of this fin de siècle opium culture, which was very much in fashion at the time, and which was very much the way of life at the Bateau Lavoir, where he had his studio. And you have to remember that Picasso's closest friends, Max Jacob, Apollinaire, Salmon, were all three heavy drug takers.
One of Picasso's most famous pictures from this period was the Demoiselle d'Avignon.
It's very difficult to be precise about Picasso's Demoiselle d'Avignon because he puts so much in it. It's like a suitcase which you fill full of clothes and have to sit on, and there are bits hanging out. Whatever was in his life at the time is in that painting, and the women, as Picasso said, Fernand Olivier was one of the whores, Marie-Laurence, and it could, in a way, reflect these opium evenings which were spent with these various women around. I don't think that you can claim there was any direct connection between Picasso's drug taking and his work. I think that it's more a kind of flavor that you get and then you don't get it. It's no more than a flavor. And I remember talking to Cocteau about this, and Cocteau said that he said he'd occasionally asked Picasso about the old days when he took drugs, and Picasso was extremely cagey about it, would never, rather try to gloss over it, didn't admit it. But he did once say that he thought opium had the most intelligent smell in the world, and that it was the greatest invention since the wheel, which did imply that it had had quite a heavy effect on him.
A regular visitor to Picasso's studio during the First World War was the brilliant young poet Jean Cocteau. After the war, Cocteau persuaded Picasso to design sets and costumes for Diaghilev's Russian ballet. The result in 1917 was the groundbreaking Parade, with music by Erik Satie, a show which regularly incensed audiences and confirmed the precocious and diverse talents of Cocteau.
Jean Cocteau depended on opium, really, for most of his life. I think when he was about 15 and ran away from home down to Marseille, he definitely saw Chinese sailors smoking opium on the ships there. And then, after his young friend Raymond Radiguet died in 1923, Cocteau was really inconsolable. And the following year, he went down to Monte Carlo, where friends of his were composing ballets. And the musicians in particular said, "Jean, you are so miserable. Why don't you try smoking opium?" Because Cocteau had already said he didn't think he would ever write again. He was so unhappy.
Monsieur Cocteau, we'd like to hear your views on the horrors of opium.
Opium remains unique in that the euphoria it produces is superior to that of health. I owe it my perfect hours.
Well, that's not a view shared by medical opinion.
It is a pity that instead of perfecting curative techniques, medicine does not try to render opium harmless.
Are you saying that if this was the case, you'd take it on a daily basis?
Without opium, plans, marriages, journeys would appear to me just as foolish as if someone falling out of a window with a hope to make friends with the occupants of the room before which he passes.
You make everyday life sound rather empty.
Everything one achieves in life, even love, occurs in an express train racing towards death. To smoke opium is to get out of the train while it is still moving, to concern oneself with something other than life or death.
But isn't it just another train, though?
Everyone speaks of the slavery of opium. The regularity it imposes on the passing hours is not only a discipline, it is also a liberation, liberation from visits and from people sitting round in circles. Without opium, I am cold, I catch cold, I do not feel hungry, I am impatient to impose what I invent. When I smoke, I'm warm, I do not know what colds are. I'm hungry, my impatience disappears. Doctors, reflect on this riddle.
He thought of himself as a poet, and he thought of the job of a poet as looking for what he calls his inner darkness. I don't think he would have wanted to admit that the themes and images in his work came from outside, or that they were as the result of taking a drug. I think he thought of the drug as a facilitator.
Cocteau's drawings are so haunting, so intense, and they illustrate such an unnatural state of mind that one could never possibly forget such things, and nobody without the enhancement of opium, I don't think, could ever have drawn them. And opium helped him. Somehow it kept him in touch with the real world and also in touch with the world of unreality at the same time, which I think is the way a poet should live.
There are certain themes and images in Cocteau's films, such as, for example, the use of slow motion and reverse slow motion, the images of the poet Orphée going through the mirror and coming back out of the mirror, and in La Belle et la Bête, where characters move down corridors and come back down corridors. Cocteau does say that he didn't actually have visions or hallucinations while he was taking opium. What he says that he experienced was a feeling of being outside time, and a feeling of the mind being released from its normal constraints. Cocteau says, for example, that the feeling was like the switchman in the mind being turned off so that the mind could move freely.
Cocteau's films are invariably described as surreal, a convenience word of great imprecision, used to describe anything that looks a bit drug-induced or dreamlike. But drugs are by no means the only route to visionary states of consciousness. Freud's theories on the unconscious, particularly those outlined in The Interpretation of Dreams, published in 1899, had a profound effect on the surrealist artists gathered in France in the 20s and 30s. The surrealists were dedicated to the pursuit and capture of the irrational world that lay beneath everyday experience. To this end, they used a variety of techniques, such as automatic writing, word association, and the close inspection of dreams and dreaming. Their art generally had such an hallucinated quality that it's often assumed that drugs must have been a major part of their working diet. This is far from the truth.
Well, having discovered access to the unconscious in 1919 by writing, automatic writing, that's to say, making your mind a blank and sitting down and writing down the first thing that comes into your head, and finding that on rereading it afterwards that it was very exciting and new and unexpected and magical. They didn't need any artificial stimulants to do that, any more than a patient of a psychiatrist needs to take drugs when lying down on the psychiatrist's couch.
There was this belief in the purity of what the surrealists were up to, and they felt that drugs would probably muddle that purity up, so they ideally achieved a state where they were as if they were on drugs when they were not. Of course, many of them drank far too heavily, but that's another matter.
As we go higher and higher, moving into the 50s, the drugs and art landscape takes on a different hue. As the West breathes again after World War II, the customs and values of the new world begin to eclipse those of the old world. The old favorites are still around, as they are today, of course. But the scene begins to be colored by potent chemicals, which aren't depressant, but are unequivocally psychotropic, or mind-opening.
The peyote cactus was used for many hundreds of years by the native Indians of the Americas for both ritualistic and religious purposes. Mescaline is the active ingredient in the peyote cactus. It produces marked hallucinogenic effects. The effects of mescaline on the body are relatively mild in that blood pressure and heart rate are increased. But the effects of mescaline on the brain are very profound. The brain has a filtering system whereby a neurotransmitter called serotonin appears to alter incoming messages so that the brain is not flooded. Mescaline interferes with this filtering system so that the brain becomes bombarded with visual, tactile, and possibly also auditory inputs.
The British novelist Aldous Huxley, author of Eyeless in Gaza, Brave New World, among others, was celebrated for his brilliant intellect and extraordinarily compendious knowledge. During the 20s and 30s, Huxley strove to balance his spiritual needs with his restless mind.
Right at the beginning of his career, Aldous Huxley was interested in the interior life, and for a very important reason in his own life, and that is that he discovered when he was a medical student, and he was studying the body itself and its structure, he had an eye defect, which deteriorated throughout his life.
He'd taken up with the Bates method for his eyes. He'd taken up the Alexander technique for his posture. He'd taken up with e-therapy and Dianetics and a whole heap of other mental and physical disciplines. And he was just ripe, you might say.
Huxley read a lot of learned journals, and in one of them he came across a doctor named Humphrey Osmond who had a new theory of schizophrenia that involved mescaline, and Huxley wrote him and said, "I'd love to take some."
One bright May morning, I swallowed 4/10 of a gram of mescaline dissolved in half a glass of water and sat down to wait for the results. I saw eternity in a flower, infinity in 4 chair legs, and the absolute in the folds of a pair of flannel trousers. Mescaline is the most extraordinary and significant experience available to human beings this side of the beatific vision.
He always was looking further in other kind of consciousness. And in fact, it seems to me that he wrote about it before he took it. I think it confirmed what somehow he knew, this feeling of light and of timelessness.
Huxley, when he took mescaline, felt that this was the substance that he'd been looking for years, a substance that promoted what he called the visionary experience, that seemed to get you outside he called it the reducing valve of the mind.
Watching him when he was taking it, I was just watching this kind of tremendous love, tremendous gentleness, tremendous acceptance and understanding. But it was a certain smile that would come that was very beautiful.
In 1954, Huxley published Doors of Perception, in which he sung the praises of mescaline. 2 years later, he wrote the companion volume, Heaven and Hell. Reactions were mixed. Some felt the celebrated man of letters had become a crackpot, but others felt that since his work generally demonstrated a high moral seriousness, his insights deserved careful scrutiny.
He didn't think that a novelist could really find it that useful, because a novel was too slow and too laborious and too tedious. In many ways, I think Aldous's running into psychedelics is really what finished him as a novelist.
The actual style doesn't change at all. It very often doesn't. I mean, if you're writing about a subject matter, and you're not a poet interested in inventing forms, or someone like Joyce inventing a new prose, his prose is just as clear and analytical as it was before.
The mescaline experience accelerated the development of Huxley's worldview, but didn't affect the quality of his writing. Now, this may be because Huxley saw language first and foremost as a vehicle for ideas, and ideas were his main stock in trade. His spiritual release came to him in exile, where the drugs of the Mexican Indians provided the catalyst for a transformation that he could never have found in England. The path of exile was also followed by the poet Robert Graves, author of I, Claudius and The White Goddess, who was introduced in the course of his American travels to a drug that had been used in ritual by the Mexican Indians for hundreds of years. On the 31st of January 1960, Graves visited Gordon Wasson's New York apartment and took pills made from the Mexican mushroom psilocybe haimsii while listening in complete darkness to a recording of a Mexican Indian priest's invocation to the god of mysteries and lightning. Graves was profoundly affected and considered that he'd eaten the food of the gods. He wrote to Wasson, expressing his gratitude.
This was not merely a red letter day, but a day marked with all the colors of a celestial rainbow. One result is that I'm now able to see pictures in my mind far more clearly than before. The mushrooms seem to have broken down some sort of barrier between thought and vision. Not completely yet, but noticeably. I have no doubt at all but that the mushrooms should be restored among Europeans and people of European descent to its original presumed position in religion. First of all, as an initiation ceremony to religion at puberty, then as a heightening of the marriage rite, finally as a viaticum. So that when the door of heaven opens, one really enters and sees those